Western and Israeli leaders and media would have you believe that the conflict in Palestine between Israeli and Palestinians began on October 7, 2023. Again and again, we hear reporters, interviewers, current and former U.S. and Israeli officials say it all started with the Hamas raid on Israel on October 7th. This is a lie that ignores over 75 years of history in Palestine. This video is for people who do not know that history, or who think they do know that history, and are, let's say, misinformed. Let's talk a little bit about colonialism. Prior to the end of World War II, colonialism was rampant throughout the world, mostly by European countries. While frequently advanced as an imperialist regime, colonialism can also take the form of settler colonialism, whereby colonial settlers invade and occupy territory to permanently replace an existing society with that of the colonizers, possibly toward a genocide of native populations. Colonizers monopolize political power and hold conquered societies and their people to be inferior to their conquerors in legal, administrative, social, cultural, or biological terms. Keep this definition of settler colonialism in your mind as you watch the rest of this video. In modern history, there was no Israel before 1948. However, there was and is a country called Palestine. Western and Israeli leaders and media would have you believe that Palestine before Israel was a bleak, barren wasteland, just waiting for the Jews to come and make the desert bloom. Or as they would say, it was a land without people. 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 For a people without a land. Those are lies. Palestine had been settled by Arabs for many centuries, and while it might not have had a European-style government, still, Muslims, Christians, Jews, Arabs, Semites, non-Semites, and others lived there side by side. After World War I, there was an increase of European Jews moving into Palestine with the intention of establishing a new Jewish state for only themselves. Details about the Zionist dreams of a greater Israel are available online. Before World War I, much of Arabia had been occupied by the Ottoman Turks. The Palestinian Arabs didn't like being occupied by the Ottoman Turks. The British promised the Arabs one big independent Arab state after the war if they helped drive the Turks out of Western Arabia. This was the McMahon-Hussein correspondence. So in 1916, the Arabs revolted against the Turks. But the Brits had lied to the Arabs. After the war, the Brits rewarded them by dividing up the defeated Ottoman Empire, including Arabia, between themselves and the French, and occupied their part of the conquest, which included Palestine. This was the Sykes-Picot Agreement. You might have heard of the Balfour Declaration. In 1917, it was made in a letter from British Foreign Secretary Arthur James Balfour to Lionel Walter Rothschild, a leader of the Anglo-Jewish community. It was a statement of British support for the establishment in Palestine of a national home for the Jewish people. This statement had no legal standing. In July 1922, the League of Nations gave Britain a mandate over Palestine with the purpose of helping foreign Jews establish a homeland there. The so-called mandate system set up by the victorious white European imperialist powers was a thinly veiled form of colonialism and occupation. U.S. Secretary of State Robert Lansing said at the time that the mandate system was simply a device created by the great powers to conceal their division of the spoils of war. The official aim of the mandate system was to allow the winners of the war to administer the newly occupied states until they could govern themselves and become independent. However, the mandate for Palestine was different. The main goal of the British mandate there was to create the conditions for the establishment of a Jewish national home, whatever that meant. Please note that neither the League of Nations, nor the British, nor Balfour had any right to Palestine other than typical Western imperialism, and had no right to take it away from the people who lived there and give it to anyone else for any reason. They did not create the State of Israel. From the start of the mandate, the British began to facilitate the immigration of European Jews to Palestine. Between 1922 and 1935, the Jewish population rose from 9% to nearly 27% of the total population. By 1947, Jews were 33% of the total population of Palestine.
If they had been plants, they would have been called non-native invasives.
Also, the British allowed the Jews to establish self-governing institutions, such as the Jewish Agency for Palestine, to prepare themselves for a state when the time came. The Palestinians were forbidden from establishing any such institutions or organizations. This inability to organize put the Palestinians at a great disadvantage to the Jews. As it turned out, the Palestinians didn't like being occupied by the British any more than they'd liked being occupied by the Turks. In 1936, they staged an uprising against the Brits. They demanded an independent sovereign Arab state and an end to open-ended Jewish immigration with the intent of establishing a Jewish homeland on Palestinian soil. It was only in 1939, as World War II was looming, that the revolt came to an end, as the British promised to restrict Jewish immigration to Palestine and promised the establishment of an independent Palestine state within a decade, just like they had promised it in 1916. It really isn't important that these immigrants were Jews. This is just what united them in their common cause. This is not about who or what they were. It's about what they did and continued to do to others who had been living in Palestine long before they got there. With the help of wealthy foreign financial backers, these Jewish immigrants armed themselves and formed what we would now call terrorist organizations. The most effective of the main pre-state terrorist groups were associated with political factions of Zionist politics. The largest of these terrorist militias, Haganah, was formed in 1920. Haganah was the terrorist arm of the Jewish Agency for Palestine, the organization most responsible for helping foreign Jews get to Palestine. Haganah was disbanded in 1948 when it was absorbed into the Israeli Defense Forces, as were most of the Jewish terrorist groups. Other Jewish terrorist organizations included Irgun and its even more violent splinter group, Lehi, also known as the Stern Gang, and the Palmar, an elite group of the Haganah. The UN, US, and UK had even labeled Irgun a terrorist group. One source stated, Irgun committed acts of terrorism and assassination against the British, whom it regarded as illegal occupiers, and it was also violently anti-Arab. So, Jews who were illegally occupying parts of Palestine and wanted to take all of it considered the British to be illegal occupiers, even though the British had been the Zionist Jews' strongest boosters and had the British mandate over Palestine, which included helping the Jews make a homeland in Palestine. Such ingrates. Many of Israel's founding fathers were leaders in terrorist organizations. Future Defense Minister General Moshe Dayan and Yitzhak Rabin were high-ranking members of the Haganah Palmach. Menachem Begin led the Irgun. Begin even bragged about being the father of modern global terrorism. Yitzhak Shamir was a prominent member of the Lehi. Born in Poland in 1915, Shamir went to Palestine in 1935. During World War II, Shamir and Lehi sought an anti-British alliance with Fascist Italy and Nazi Germany to make it easier for European Jews to emigrate to Palestine. However, they were unable to persuade the fascist powers to lend them support. Rabin, Shamir, and Begin would later become prime ministers of Israel. You can look up their terrorist activities online. World War II ended and the UN was established in 1945. In 1947, the UN proposed a plan to partition Palestine into a Jewish state and a Palestinian state. While the plan was approved by the UN General Assembly, it could not be implemented because it required the agreement of all affected parties, and the Palestinians never agreed to it. And why would they? It gave away over half of their land to the minority newcomers. In 1948, Jews were only 33% of the total population of Palestine, and almost half of those who recently arrived within the last 25 years. Ilan Pappé is an Israeli political scientist and historian and a professor at the University of Exeter in the UK.
From the mid-1930s, and definitely immediately after the Second World War, the Zionist political and military leadership contemplated and planned mass expulsion of Palestinians in order to create what they thought would be a Jewish democratic state. They wanted as much of Palestine as possible, with as few Palestinians in it as possible. Their main problem in 1947, 1948, when the British rule came to an end, was that the Jews in Palestine were only 1/3 of the population. And even when the United Nations took over the issue of Palestine from Britain and suggested to partition Palestine into an Arab state and a Jewish state in November 1947, the demographics were such that even in the Jewish state that was offered by the United Nations, the Jews were still not the majority because there were too few Jews.
We could put this another way. Instead of saying there were too few Jews, is that there were too many Arabs, and they would have to go. And that is ethnic cleansing. But even U.S. President Harry Truman knew that that would have to happen.
In the country, even among the Jews, the Zionists particularly, who were against anything that was to be done if they couldn't have the whole of Palestine and everything handed to them on a silver plate so they wouldn't have to do anything. It couldn't be done. We had to take it in small doses. You can't move 5 or 6 million people out of a country and fill it up with 5 or 6 million more and expect both sets of them to be pleased.
Truman's message was clear. The native Arab population was to be removed. While the British had prohibited the Palestinians from organizing, by 1948 the Jews already had an army that was formed out of the armed paramilitary groups trained and created to fight side by side with the British in World War II, and from the Jewish terrorist groups. Also, when the Brits pulled out on May 14, 1948, they left their military equipment, including tanks, artillery, trucks, etc., which the Jews promptly seized for themselves. Remember that back in 1939, as part of a deal to end the Arab uprising, the Brits had promised the Arabs their own independent sovereign state within 10 years? Remember that? 1949 was the deadline for the Brits to make good on that promise, but facing increasing Jewish terrorist attacks against them, the Brits betrayed the Arabs on that promise too. And right after the Brits left, in 1948, the Jewish terrorists declared their independent sovereign Jewish state of Israel. This triggered the first Arab-Israeli war when Egypt, Syria, Jordan, Saudi Arabia, Iraq, and Lebanon declared war on Israel. Egypt, Jordan, and Syria invaded Palestine to rescue it from Jewish conquest, but were unsuccessful. In April 1949, the last warring Arab state signed an armistice with Israel. By the end of the war, the new Jewish state controlled 20% to 50% more territory than the UN partition plan had allotted for them. Here's John Mearsheimer, a University of Chicago professor of political science and international relations.
There's no way Jews or Zionists moving out of Europe can come into an area that's filled with Palestinians and create a Jewish state without cleansing the area. They understood that from the beginning. This is very clear from the historical record. The Zionists who came out of Europe and, laid the foundation for what is Israel today were very smart people. I mean, they were very smart, very clever. They knew exactly what they were doing. And they understood that they would have to do horrible things to the Palestinians in order to create a Jewish state. It was just inevitable. There's no way you could create a Jewish state otherwise.
During the creation of the Jewish state from 1947 to 1949, Jews expropriated, stole 78% of Palestinian land. A series of Jewish terrorist massacres destroyed over 500 Palestinian cities, towns, and villages. The Jews expelled 750 to 900,000 Palestinian Arabs from their homes. Half of the Arab population was displaced, and they killed 15,000 Palestinians, including women and children. The Jews poisoned wells, demolished homes, businesses, places of worship, and urban centers, all to prevent the Palestinians, now refugees in their own land, from returning. Then the conquering European colonial Jewish settlers took that Palestinian land and homes for themselves. This the Palestinians call the Nakba, the catastrophe, that mass crime against Palestinian humanity, the massacres, the ethnic cleansing and expulsion of Palestinians from their homeland, that original and continuous crime for which Palestinians have never had justice, remains an open wound in the hearts of the Palestinian people, their children and grandchildren. It is an over 75-year-old crime against humanity for which the criminals have never been held to account. Here is a compilation of remarks by Jews who fought for Israel against the Palestinians in the 1948 Nakba.
הרגנו בהם, בלי נקיפת מצפון.
הרגת, אז עשית דבר טוב. הייתי מוכן להרוג.
אני אספר לה שאני הייתי רוצח.
עד היום רק שהיית אקדח, אתה תהרג את כולם.
יאללה, רפו אותם כמו פרות,
בזמן קרב, אם מישהו הרים ידיים, משהו כזה, לא לקחתי שבויים.
כמה אתה חושב אנשים הרגת ככה?
לא ספרתי. אני לא יכול לדעת בחיי.
הוא תפס אישה, חתיכה צעירה, נכנס לבית אחד, הכין חדר מיטות, עם מיטה, פרטה לזיין אותה.
הילדה חזרה, סמרטוטיה.
אחד אנס שם איזה ילדה בת 16, משהו כזה. אתה מבין? אבל זה מכוער מאוד, היה לנו בחור אחד, הוא נפטר, הוא היה פרא אדם, הוא לקח פשוט מאוד ורצח אותם בתוך המכלאות. חוטי ברזל כאלה, עגולים כאלה, אספו כל הגברים. הם יושבים שם כולם על הרצפה, ובא מישהו ולוקח תת מקלע ומתחיל זה, מחליף מחסנית, שלקחו את הלוויורים ורדפו אחרי חבר'ה ושרפו אותם. זה היה משהו זוועתי, וזה אסור לספר, אני לא אדבר על זה.
מלחמה זה מלחמה.
Israel's founding is synonymous with terror and displacement for Palestinians. The massacres of families and towns left enduring scars on the survivors. And it goes on and on. Remember the definition of colonization from the beginning of the video? Settler colonialism is where colonial settlers invade an occupied territory to permanently replace an existing society with their own, monopolizing political power and regarding conquered societies to be inferior to theirs, possibly leading to the genocide of native populations. Well, with the help of the British and then the U.S., this is exactly what the Zionist Jews have done in Palestine. The writings and speeches of their founding fathers make this very clear. Here's an example. David Ben-Gurion is regarded as the founding father of Israel. Born in Poland in 1886 to Polish Jewish parents, he went to Palestine in 1906. He was the leader of the Jewish Agency for Palestine and became Israel's first prime minister and minister of defense in 1948. In 1919, he wrote, "Everybody sees a difficulty in the question of relations between Arabs and Jews, but not everybody sees that there is no solution to this problem. No solution. There is a gulf, and nothing can bridge it. We, as a nation, want this country to be ours. The Arabs, as a nation, want this country to be theirs." Also in 1919, he said, "A people which fights against the usurpation of its land will not tire so easily." Usurpation, that is theft. In 1937, Ben-Gurion said, "We will expel the Arabs and take their place. In each attack, a decisive blow should be struck, resulting in the destruction of homes and the expulsion of the population."
In a 1948 speech to Israeli officers, Ben-Gurion said,
"We must use terror, assassination, intimidation, land confiscation, the cutting off of all social services, to free Israel from its Arab population." Here are some undated quotes from Ben-Gurion. "Let us not ignore the truth among ourselves. Politically, we are the aggressors and they defend themselves. The country is theirs because they inhabit it, whereas we want to come here and settle down, and in their view, we want to take away from them their country. The Arabs will have to go, but one needs an opportune moment for making it happen, such as a war. We must do everything to ensure they do not return. The old ones will die, and the young ones will forget. No, they won't. Why should the Arabs make peace? If I was an Arab leader, I would never make terms with Israel. That is natural. We have taken their country. There has been anti-Semitism, the Nazis, Hitler, Auschwitz, but was that their fault? They only see one thing. We have come here and stolen their country. Why should they accept that? Yitzhak Shamir, the 7th Prime Minister of Israel. Born 1915 in Poland, Shamir went to Palestine in 1935 and formed the terrorist group Lehi. Neither Jewish morality nor Jewish tradition can be used to disallow terror as a means of war. Ariel Sharon, 11th Prime Minister of Israel, born in Palestine in 1928 to Russian Jewish immigrant parents. It is the duty of Israeli leaders to explain to public opinion, clearly and courageously, a certain number of facts that are forgotten with time. The first of these is that there is no Zionism, colonialization, or Jewish state without the eviction of the Arabs and the expropriation of their land. This quote I found on several websites, but its authenticity is disputed. But Sharon supposedly said in a 1956 interview, "I vow that if I was just an Israeli civilian and I met a Palestinian, I would burn him and I would make him suffer before killing him. With one hit, I've killed 750 Palestinians." That was in Rafah in 1956. "I wanted to encourage my soldiers by raping Arabic girls, as the Palestinian woman is a slave for Jews, and we do whatever we want to her, and nobody tells us what we shall do, but we tell others what they shall do." You can find many more revealing and undisputed quotes by Sharon online. Yitzhak Rabin, the 5th Israeli Prime Minister. Rabin was born in Jerusalem in 1922 to Jewish immigrant parents from Eastern Europe. He said, "I believe in the long run, separation between Israel and the Palestinians is the best solution for resolving the Israel-Palestinian conflict. Israel will create in the course of the next 10 to 20 years conditions which would attract natural and voluntary migration of the refugees from the Gaza Strip and the West Bank to Jordan. Would those conditions be anything like the conditions the Nazis created in Europe, which attracted the natural and voluntary migration of Jews out of Europe?" Israeli General Moshe Dayan was a member of the pre-state terrorist group Haganah, an IDF commander during the Nakba, and was a hero of the 1967 Six-Day War when he was defense minister. In an address to the Technion Haifa, reported in Haaretz, April 4, 1969, Dayan said, "Jewish villages were built in the place of Arab villages. You do not even know the names of these Arab villages, and I do not blame you because geography books no longer exist. Not only do the books not exist, the Arab villages are not there either. There is not a single place built in this country that did not have a former Arab population." And in an undated quote he said, "Israel must invent dangers, and to do this we must adopt the strategy of provocation and revenge." Another undated quote, "The method of collective punishment so far has proved effective." You can find many more incriminating quotes from these and other prominent Israelis online. But look what we have already. We want to come here and settle down. Separation of Arabs and Palestinians is the best solution. Expel the Arabs, attack them, expulsion of the population. The Arabs have to go. So let's have a war. Terror is a valid means of war. Usurpation of their land, destruction of homes. We must use terror, assassination, land confiscation, the eviction of the Arabs and the expropriation of their land. Every place had a former Arab population. Jewish villages were built in the place of Arab villages. The country is theirs because they live in it. We have taken their country. We have come and taken away their country. We have come here and stolen their country. How much clearer can it be? So, when anyone starts a discussion on Palestine with October 7th, or by saying the Palestinians or Hamas or whomever attacked Israel, they are either ignorant of the full history of the conflict, or they are deliberately and falsely framing it to make Israel look like the victim, and that's just Israeli propaganda. By now, it should be clear to you that the problem is not the Palestinians. It's not Hamas, or Hezbollah, or Islamic Jihad, or the PLO, or the Palestinian Authority, Fatah, or Iran. The problem is Israel, and has been all along. By now, it should be clear to you that Jews are the original, current, and continuous terrorists, aggressors, and oppressors in Palestine. Palestinian Arabs are the original, current, and continuous victims of that aggression and oppression. It is reasonable and should have been expected that the dispossessed Palestinians, their children and grandchildren, would want their land and homes back and would try to reclaim them. Palestinians have every right to resist the Jewish occupation, oppression, and ethnic cleansing. Remember Ben-Gurion's words. We, Jews, have come from Europe and stolen their country. Why would they accept that? I say again, this is not about Jews versus Arabs or Hebrews versus Muslims. It is about a group of people who moved into a land that they knew had been settled for many centuries and many generations, armed themselves, and then drove the people who lived there out of their homes and off of their land, and then took that land for themselves. They have continued this crime to this day, oppressing, expelling, and killing Palestinians while expanding their state, stealing more and more land. Now, can you understand how it is reasonable for the Palestinians to want Israel to disappear, to want it wiped off the map so that they, the Palestinians, can reclaim their homes, their lands, their country? Isaac Asimov is an award-winning Russian-born American science and science fiction writer. About Israel, he wrote that he remembered how in 1948 Israel was established and all his Jewish friends were ecstatic, but he was not. He told them,
"What are we doing? We are establishing ourselves in a ghetto, in a small corner of a vast Muslim sea. The Muslims will never forget or forgive, and Israel, for as long as it exists, will be embattled." I was laughed at, but I was right.
And he is still right. So long as Israel exists as a racist, exclusionary Jewish state, the conflict and violence will persist. Religious beliefs, documents, and doctrines notwithstanding, the only right Israel has to exist is the right of conquest, settler colonial conquest, and the tacit approval of Israel's allies also notwithstanding, that is not a right recognized under any international law. Israel is a stolen country. Will the Palestinians ever get justice?